before we go to a share screen, we'll take a moment just to utter the words of Psalm 133, Hine ma tov u'manaim shevet achim gam yachad. How good it is for brothers and sisters to be together, particularly on this night and this evening together. Hine ma tov u'manaim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manaim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. I'm going to be sharing the screen this evening with our service before we get to our speaker. And you will see here the front of our building with these rather important daffodils that are part of a daffodil project to remember the 6 million Jews who died, the yellow stars they wore, the daffodils, of course, like a Jewish star. As an introduction for this night, I want to quote from Nelson Mandela, who once said, "Our world is not divided by race, color, gender, or religion. Our world is divided into wise people and fools divide themselves by race, color, gender, or religion."
No.
God has made us in a divinely inspired and fashioned way. The core of us as humans is the same, and yet we are each unique. When a fool sees color, race, and various distinctions, they do so at the harm of all of us. Our people have suffered countless brutalities, atrocities, indiscretions, and cruelties because of foolishness, hatred, and lies. This night of remembering the Shoah and the resistance is to actively recall the 6 million Jews, the 5 million political dissidents, Roma, Gypsies, members of the LGBTQ community, those who were physically or mentally differently abled. I'm grateful to our brotherhood for convening and sponsoring this night. I'm grateful to Meg Waite Clayton for her creating yet another pathway for us to understand how humanity's foolishness so readily and easily creates inhumanity to humanity. I'm grateful to Margot Lobrie, who remains one of the greatest teachers, not just in our community, but of our community, by sharing her story from having been a part of the Kindertransport, to her placing anger aside and working and living a life that is positive and above and of blessing above all else, in which she even shared as we were gathering tonight, a new great-grandchild. Margot, Mazel Tov to you and your family. Thinking of life in and amongst and when we remember, yes, the atrocities and the death that has occurred for our people. Thank you, Lindsay, for your leadership in our brotherhood, and tonight for introducing your mother shortly. When we start Yom HaShoah, we do so as is customary in Israel. It is with the sound of a siren. In Israel, everybody knows that the siren will sound at a specific time on the evening and then again in the morning, and the world stops for this siren. And so we take a moment to pause and to remember and allow this sound to roll through our hearts and our collective memory. yigamer leolam. Hachol ve'ayam rish rosh shel hamayim berak hashamayim tfilat adam hachol ve'ayam rish rosh shel hamayim berak hashamayim tfilat adam. O Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. Elie Wiesel wrote, "Never say that society will not do this or that. It will. Never seek shelter in convenient illusions that history will know when to stop so as not to destroy itself. It will not." This is a lesson I've learned years and massacres ago. I belong to a generation traumatized by mass murder, considered at that time a normal event. Whoever has seen a death camp will tell you the impossible does become possible. The unthinkable does come to pass. It is too late for the dead. Is it too late for the living as well? It may be, it will be, if we forget. Is there anything we can do? There must be. Surely apathy is not the answer, nor is silence. Despair is not the solution. Despair is the question. I invite Jason McKinney, our cantorial soloist, to share and sing these words of the partisan. Zognik Time.
Sag nicht kein Mal, als du gehst im letzten Weg, aus dem Bleien verstellen reue Tag. Mal kommen weg noch unser ausgebänkte Show, wird der Beut und unser Tag mehr sehnen da. Mal kommen weg noch unser ausgebänkte Show, wird der Beut und unser Tag mehr sehnen da. Never say that you have reached the very end. Though leaden skies a bit of future may portend. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps with thunder we survive. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps with thunder we survive. Mit Palmenland, mit Weisen fein von Schnee. Wir kommen mit unser Pein, mit unser Weg. Und ungefallen dieser Spritz von unser Blut. Spotzen wird durch unser Gure, unser Mut. Und wohlgefallen schwitzt von unser Blut. Spotze fort, dort unser Gure, unser Mut. Lands all green with palms will land all white with snow. We now arrive with all our pain and all our woe. For where our blood spread out and came to touch the land, there our courage and our faith will rise and stand. Where our blood spread out and came to touch the land, there our courage and our faith will rise and stand. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl ohne Vogelofte frei. Das Holz, das Hock zwischen Fragen, die gewinnt. das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das rote Fock zwischen Fahnen, die gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Not led but burdens cry, it's a song we sing. 'Tis not a caroling of birds upon the wing, but 'twas a people midst the crashing fires of hell that sang the song and fought courageous till it fell. But 'twas a people midst the crashing fires of hell that sang the song and fought courageous till it fell. Dagen it came oss zu geist dem Lexen weg, aus himlen bleien verschwellen bläue Tag, da kommen bet noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, wird der Beut und unser Tat mit Tränen da, da kommen bet noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, wird der Beut und unsere Tat mit
We call upon God, who is the master of mercy, that God should bring God's mercy to the souls who have perished. El male rachamim, shochen b'meromim, hamseh menucha nechona al kanfei hashechina, b'ma'alot kedoshim utehorim, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנטבחו ושנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. בעל הרחמים הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen. God, full of compassion, dwelling on high, grant perfect rest under the wings of your divine presence, among the holy and pure who shine as the light of the firmament, to the souls of all our brothers and sisters, the men, women, and children who were murdered, slaughtered, gassed, burnt, and killed. May their rest be found in the Garden of Eden. Master of mercy, gather them forever beneath your wings. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. God is their inheritance. May they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. We take a moment to remember. We'll read responsively. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them. In the opening of buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. In the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. So long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. We have a few individuals who will be lighting candles virtually on this evening, and I'm very grateful. Our readers will be Bob Kahn, Ronna Klein, Mary Peller, Sam Roll, and Annalise Klaus Todrink. You'll each read, you've got your readings. Whenever you're ready to start, Bob, with our first candle, please, as you're ready.
We light the first candle for all the rabbis, scholars, and teachers murdered by the Nazis, for the lamp of learning that was snuffed out by the criminals.
We light the second candle for the mothers and the fathers who saw their children torn away from them and then were killed themselves in the death camps.
We light the third candle for the more than 1.5 million children slaughtered by the Germans, young people who had no sin, who did no wrong.
We light the fourth candle for the millions of gays and lesbians, the Romani, the political dissidents, the physically different, all of whom were murdered by hands of hatred.
We light the fifth candle for the survivors of the Holocaust, forced to live without their loved ones, haunted by the nightmares of a world gone mad.
We light the sixth candle for the world, the greatest victim of all. For the world lost millions of good and decent people, talented and intelligent human beings who could have made this a better existence in which to live. In addition to the six visible candles, we kindle a seventh candle in our hearts, which is dedicated to the determination that a Shoah will never happen again. There was in the chat space, Cynthia's placed a reading for us to all share together, as we'll read together those words that are there. Let these flames be a symbol of our resolve never to permit such evil to succeed and such terror to flourish. Our promise that we will stand guard on behalf of all good people against another Holocaust. Kaddish that we share on this night is one that's written for Yom HaShoah HaGevurah. It is written as a moment, a Kaddish for this time of remembering the Shoah and the Gevurah, the Holocaust and the resistance. You will note that the Hebrew words are there, and interspersed are names of places of death camps, which are part of this tragic story. We'll read slowly, reading the Hebrew word and then the name of the camp or location. Yitkadal, Auschwitz. V'yitkadash, Lodz. Shmei Rabbah, Ponar. Ba'alma divarach hirutei, Babiyar. V'yamlich malchutei, Maidanek. B'chayechon uv'yomechon, Birkenau. Uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, Kovno. Ba'agala uv'izman kariv, Janowska. V'imeru, Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, Theresienstadt. V'yitpa'ar v'yitromam, Buchenwald. V'yitnaseh v'yithadar, Treblinka. V'yitale v'yitalal, Vilna. Shemei Kudsha, Bergen-Belsen. Brich Hu, Mauthausen. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, Dachau. Tushbechata v'nechemata, Minsk. Da'amiran be'alma, Warsaw. V'imeru, Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shmaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imeru, Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imeru, Amen. May the one who makes peace in the heavens above make peace for us and for all Israel. And let us say, Amen. we as a people have survived because we hold in us hope for something more than what is. And as a Jewish people, of course, the land of Israel is our people's home, and there was for 2,000 years a hope for that land to be in our hands. And indeed, that did come to pass by 1948, tragically 3 years after the end of the war. This hope that we hold on to for a land that is still in process of being made. We live in an era when it does exist. May we hold that hope and work with one another to build a world of freedom and peace for one and all. The words of Hatikva. It is with that hope that led people to try to save children during the war, that led to the kinder transport and all the people who were bringing children to safety. It is with hope that Nelson Mandela made that declaration, that statement, that what it means, what we can do when he said, our world is not divided by race, color, gender, or religion. Our world is divided into wise people and fools divide themselves by race, color, gender, or religion. It is on us to be wise and work with one another. We have a mitzvah to do tonight. It's counting the Omer, and then I'll introduce Lindsay. We'll read in the blessing. We are commanded to count each day from that second day of Pesach to receiving Torah at Sinai. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu al sfirat ha'omer, hayom 12 yom shehem shavua echad v'arba'a yamim la'omer, Today is the 11th day, which is 1 week and 4 days of the Omer. Lindsay came to me a while back with an idea for Yom HaShoah to speak tonight, that we would have this wonderful author who's written this book and that his mom was involved with. And I said, that just sounds fabulous. We are grateful, Lindsay, for your leadership with the Brotherhood and helping to bring us to this night. And you will introduce your mother, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Yes. As Brotherhood President, I am honored that our organization is presenting tonight's program for Yom HaShoah, Remembering the Holocaust. 82 years ago this month, a young Margot Hirschman was put on Kindertransport train by her mother just 6 weeks after her brother Uri left for Israel with the Zionist youth movement. She left from the Frankfurt train station onto a train with other children to a strange country with strange customs and a strange language, never to see her mother again and her brother decades later. Margot's experience and story does parallel some of the experiences the children in the story went through in Meg Waite Clayton's best-selling novel, Last Train to London. For that reason, my mother is one of those acknowledged by Meg that encouraged her to research her and write her novel. It is my pleasure to call upon my mother, Margot Lobry, to introduce tonight's guest speaker.
Margot, you're muted.
Thank you, Lindsay. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. In August of 2019, I received an email from Meg Waite Clayton telling me about the book that she had just been published, The Last Train to London. She sent me a copy in which she wrote, "With gratitude for sharing your story and sharing it with the children of the Palo Alto Children's Theater, including my son, Nick, who brought the story home to me. Meg's diligence, her passion, our broad and powerful story. To read it. Born in Washington, D.C. She was a New Year's of the University School in history and psychology from the same university. She worked as an attorney in Los Angeles. She grew up primarily in the suburban Kansas City and the suburban Chicago. Graduated from Glenbrook High School. She started writing in earnest after moving to a horse farm outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and she now resides in Northern California. In addition to her work as a novelist, she has written for the Los Angeles Times, Writer's Digest, Runner's World, and Public Radio. Her first book was published in 2003, and her new book will come out in September of this year. It is with affection that at this time I call on Meg to take over.
Thank you so much, Margot, and thank you, Rabbi and Lindsay. I want to start by saying I am just so honored to be here, and my only regret is that because of the pandemic, I can't be in person giving Margot a big hug. I'm going to start, let me screen share here so you guys can see the program. And let's see now, there we go. You should be full screen. I don't usually linger on this page because it feels a little embarrassing to have so many blessings. But I will tell you that part of the reason I want to do this is because Margot this book literally would not exist without Margot. It's a sort of my own kind of seventh candle, my own plea to the world to look around and see what's happening, and don't let things happen again. But it started for me. I'll talk a little bit about it. But it started for me with four
Use
women.
this. You'll hear this better.
So with four women who shared their stories with my son, one of whom was Margot. And the result of those four individuals sharing their stories is this story that I wrote, going out into the world now in 20 languages, so that literally people that neither Margot nor I could speak to, could even say hello to on the street in Lithuania or Russia or Spain or Portugal or Brazil, the Netherlands, all these places, these people can take this story into their hearts and understand what it meant to be on the Kindertransport. So I'll talk a little bit more about Margot's role in this in a minute, but I just want you to know how important she was to this story. So let's start by looking at this. If you were here with me in person, we were together in person, I'd ask you just to shout out if you know what it is. In the meantime, I want to just thank everybody for being here. This is a bit of an odd time that we're living in. My days, I will tell you, are not that different than they usually are. I spend them in my little imaginary playhouse office, playing with my imaginary friends and creating stories. But there are so many people I miss in this time, and so it's lovely to spend time with other people, and particularly on a night like tonight. So this is actually a bandage box, and I'll tell you, if you've read The Last Train to London, you'll be thinking perhaps what bandage box is in that book, and I'll tell you there isn't one. I never stop researching once I get my teeth into a subject, and that is particularly true for the Kindertransport. This novel is probably closer to my heart than any novel I have ever written or will ever write. But I saw this in a presentation, in a exhibit in New York on the Kindertransport after the book was finished. And I actually stood in front of it weeping. And I felt very unsettled weeping over such an ordinary thing. But the docent came to me and said, yeah, the bandage box, it gets everyone. And so I hope that if you read The Last Train to London, you'll come to understand how such a small, ordinary thing can be so moving. It was put on in a suitcase that a child took to London with them more than 80 years ago after their parents put them on the Kindertransport. So I would, if we were in person, I would also ask you to raise your hand or shout out if you know who this person is. So I'm going to have you look at it and think about if you know who it is. And while you're doing that, I will take this opportunity to thank the NIOD of the Netherlands for allowing me to use this photograph. It's a photograph of Truus Weissemuller. If you're not raising your hand, you're not alone. She's Dutch, and she's a real-life hero on the scale of Oskar Schindler, of Schindler's List fame. And she's so completely forgotten that when my novel was sent to HarperCollins in the Netherlands, who translated it into Dutch, her own language, nobody in the entire office had ever heard of her. I'm going to speak a little bit today about where the novel started, spoiler alert, not with Truus. And the real story behind it and how I came to write it and dig out the story. I usually would start with a short little piece on how I start writing. I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to slip through the slides just to show two and tell you why in a second. So this is me circa 1970 at the Sierra Madre Library. So note that if you're a librarian, please prepare to pat yourself on the back. And this is my 8th grade English teacher, Miss Thompson, who encouraged me to send this poem for publication. I will tell you I did, and it was not accepted, and I didn't submit anything for 20 years. But I want you to note that I still have this poem that my teacher handed back to me with her little A plus in the back corner, almost a half century after I wrote it. So that's my little way of saying to teachers and librarians, what a huge difference you make in lives. I literally would not be a writer without the support of the teachers and librarians in my life, so thank you. Okay, so The Last Train to London. Last Train to London is based on the true story of the Kindertransport effort to rescue 10,000 children from Nazi-occupied Europe before World War II began, and one extraordinary woman who led the effort. I think it's fairly, my experience is that it's fairly well known. The effort is fairly well known in the Jewish community. It is known almost not at all outside the Jewish community. Indeed, I had never heard of it until my son brought the story home to me, and I was a history major with a focus on World War II. So I'm going to start with a short little, it's literally 30 seconds that I like to share. It's a video that my stepdaughter, my very talented stepdaughter, put together for me, and part of the reason I like it is because it has some footage from the real Kindertransports. So. So that footage is mostly from the Prague Kindertransports that started later in the summer. Anyway, so The Last Train to London is sometimes described as Truce's story, but as I said, it didn't begin for me with Truce. It began for me a decade ago. I will tell you, it was actually May 12th, 2007. When my then teenage son, he was 15 at the time, arrived home troublingly silent. He was a very joyous boy. He would literally ride his bike down the street singing at the top of his lung, and like the two who have sung today, he has a beautiful voice. My worst nightmare would be to sing in public. So he came home and he was not saying a word, and I thought, maybe some girl had broken his heart for the first time or something. And finally I asked him, if something was going on. And he said he was just processing something that had happened to him that day, that he'd done that day, which was he had interviewed a woman put on a Kindertransport when she was 9 years old. So I first began to learn about this effort in order to help my then young son understand what he was learning, which had moved him to silence. Nick and his theater friends would go on to interview 4 women saved in the Kindertransport: Ellen Fletcher, Helga Newman, Elizabeth Miller, and your own Margot. But before they could write the play, their director had in mind that they would research, write, and perform a play about the Kindertransport. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and quite quickly after that passed away. The children, mostly older than my own son, scattered off to colleges and never did write their play. But I was left haunted by these stories. I was left trying to imagine how I could, as a mother, put my children on a train to take them to a different country where they didn't speak the language or necessarily have anyone to love them. I was left trying to imagine how it would be to be somebody like Margot getting on that train. So most of the time I was learning about this story, learning about the Kindertransport, reading books about it, watching documentaries, eventually watching, listening to, and reading interviews about people involved in the effort, including the rescued children. I wasn't thinking I could write a book about an attempt organized primarily by Jewish leaders in Britain, including Simon Marks there in the bottom right corner, and Norman and Helen Bentwich, to try to rescue mostly Jewish children from Nazi-occupied Europe to take them to England in what would turn out to be the 9 months before World War II began. Here's a little secret: I'm not Jewish. I'd learned fairly early on about a man named Nicholas Winton, who you all may have heard of. He led the Prague rescues, and that gave me the idea that there must have been somebody who also led the Vienna and Berlin rescues. I went searching and found, literally years into the effort, the name Truce Weissmuller. Armed with Truce's name, I could Google her and find an entry in Righteous Among Nations. It didn't even include the word kindertransport, but it did tell me that Truce's big advantage was that she was a Gentile with access to the Nazi power structure. So I'm not Jewish, but neither was Truce. Neither were a lot of people involved in this effort. So oddly, as daunting as Truce is, when I learned of her, I was suddenly less daunted about taking on this story. It seemed to me all of a sudden, it was like an aha moment. Yeah, this is a story that we should all be involved in, that we should all know, that we should all try to learn from and emulate. So here's another little secret. I'm not Dutch any more than I am Jewish. That did cause some challenges, shall we say, in the research process, but I'll get to that. So the story of the Last Train to London is in some ways three stories. It's the story of the many people in England involved in this effort. The Executive Committee of the Central Jewish Fund, which devised the plan and got the effort through Parliament. That's Norman and Helen Bentwich, publisher Dennis Cohen, who with Helen drafted the plan, Simon Marks of Marks and Spencer, the banker Lionel Rothschild, and many others, as well as, honestly, Prime Minister Chamberlain, Viscount Samuel, whose radio address helped raise the money to fund it, and the many people who took children into their homes. So that's also the story of Truce. And those on the ground in Vienna who helped the children, made the trains happen. And it is, of course, the story of the children and their families. So that's where I started writing it, where it had started for me with the children and their families. I surrounded myself with some photos of the real children, including this group here and this girl. And I used this girl to create one of my protagonists, whose name is Sophie Len. Sophie is a teenager, a math prodigy, the child of an anti-Nazi journalist and a Christian. You might note that this girl isn't a teenager. I will tell you, she's also not Austrian, as my character is. My character is not Jewish, and even the hair color is different from my Sophie Len. But I felt such compassion when I saw this photograph that the love poured out of me, and I tried to pour that into my Sophie Len. I didn't actually know who this girl was until the whole time I was writing the novel. It's in some ways helpful for me not to have a personal story when I'm creating fiction. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum identifies her only as refugee girl. But after I'd finished writing the novel, I was very curious to know who she was, and so I went searching and found finally in the Bullmash collection at Kenyon College that she is Helga Kreiner from Berlin, who was put on the first Kindertransport that actually left from Berlin on December 2nd, 1938. So in my novel, Sophie meets a slightly older boy named Stefan, who is not this boy, but again, the photo evoked in me the kind of love that I could pour into creating the character of Stefan. Stefan is an aspiring playwright who, unlike Sophie, has lots of friends. These children, Stefan and Sophie, are based on hundreds of hours of research about the real children involved in the Kindertransport. But they don't actually exist anywhere but in my mind, on the page, and if I've done my job well, in your minds and perhaps in your hearts as well. One of the benefits of historical fiction, rather than straight history, is that it does invite us to step into somebody else's shoes. It does invite us to imagine ourselves as them. So I hope through this novel to make people feel what it was like to live this moment, to make people feel what it means to close borders to people in need, and to close our hearts to people in need. And I hope also, and this is where Truce comes in, to help people understand what it means to give to others, to act courageously, and to be selfish, to act selflessly. I think that if that is the one thing that this novel accomplishes, then it will have done a lot of what I want to do. Atticus Finch, one of my own favorite literary heroes, in To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, describes courage not as a man with a gun in his hand, but rather It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. And that is what truce is for me, somebody who sees it through no matter what. So Sophie and Stefan do things like the kids do everywhere, like ride this Ferris wheel in Prater Park. I like to do as much of what my characters do as I possibly can to be able to take their experiences into my heart. But I will tell you that I am quite unhappy at heights, and so I didn't actually go up in this Ferris wheel. So I don't suppose it will be giving too much away to suggest that my two teenage characters, well, maybe one of them will become sweet on the other. I actually only meant for them to be friends when I started writing the story, but teenagers will be teenagers. Stefan's father owns a chocolate factory, something I did because, of course, if I have a character who makes chocolate, then of course I have to taste every chocolate that comes my way in the name of research. So actually, the reason I made Stefan's father a chocolatier is I wanted to show that the Jewish population of Vienna before the Anschluss was integrated into Vienna society and prosperous, and a chocolate business was as evocative a way as I could think of to allow readers, shall we say, a taste of that. Before Hitler invaded Austria, more than half of Vienna's bankers, lawyers, and doctors were Jewish, along with half of its journalists. Hitler was just across the border, and anti-Semitism was on the rise, but here's the thing. First, Hitler was seen as a joke. Even after he was made Chancellor of Germany, people thought it was a madness that surely would pass. And he was across the border. It was hard for people to imagine, people leading comfortable lives, prosperous lives, to imagine that this madness would cross over the border into Austria and interrupt their own lives. Until he wasn't, until he was riding through Vienna with crowds cheering him. The change that occurred over years in Germany took only a few months in Austria. When 1938 opened, Austria was a free country with its Nazis literally behind bars. In March, Hitler invaded. In November, Kristallnacht. And then the Kindertransports began very shortly after Kristallnacht. So Stefan's father is owns a chocolate business that has underneath it, the building, an entrance to a fairly amazing underground world that really does exist under Vienna, or did at the time. There are tunnels of various sorts. Some are natural, some are man-made, some are sewers. Some of them are where they literally reran the river underground. There's a 3-story area that used to be a convent. There's an underground area that used to be a Talmud school. And there's even an area that used to be an underground horse stable. There's a crypt, and not all the bones are in coffins. So what better place for a teenager to try to kiss an infatuation than in the dark underground where scary guys like Orson Welles hang out? That is literally Orson Welles from a movie called The Third Man, based on the extraordinary novel by Graham Greene. And it was filmed in the Vienna underground right after the war ended. So it was a way for me to see what the underground looked like then. I'll tell you now, in some of those places, some of these underground places are now bars and nightclubs. But this gave me a look in at it and at the time. One of the nice things about being a writer is you get to read in the middle of the afternoon and call it work, and sometimes even watch old movies in the middle of the afternoon and call that work too. So 1938, Hitler crosses the border and takes Austria. People in Vienna realize they need to leave, but by then borders around the world are closing. Not closing to everybody, but closing to Jews, whose passports Hitler was soon stamping with that red J you see on the left there, stamping Sarah over the women's names and Israel over the men's, as if an entire people could be dismissed with single names. After Hitler invaded Austria, desperate parents began running ads like this in the British papers. This one says, urgent, director of Viennese chocolate factory, whose circumstances are sadly depleted due to the political situation, is extremely anxious to place his son with refined and charitable family. Boy, age 10, is of bright and happy disposition. I have to tell you, I've read that a lot of times now, and I cannot read it without thinking of writing it about my own sons. So into this void of children in peril steps Truce Weissmuller. She's been rescuing children from Nazi Germany by the time my story opens, but in small numbers. And the people who were organizing the Kindertransport had in mind to rescue thousands. I'll tell you that my research, when I was doing it, was turning up absolutely nothing. It was December 2016, so 8 years after I first learned about the transports, before I came upon this notice of a publication of a biography of Truce. Despite the notice being very conveniently in English, which I do read, the book was published only in Dutch. It was 50 years out of print even then, and there were no copies for sale anywhere in the world. There were only a half a dozen copies in the United States. The closest to me, I'm in California, and it was at the University of Minnesota, 2,000 miles away. So fortunately for me, my older son had just started a PhD program on the other side of the country in Boston. And his university happened to be one of the ones that had one of the few copies in the United States. So I rang him up and said, hey, Chris, could you just check this book out of your library, photocopy it for me, and send it to me? There was a very long pause on the phone, long enough for me to think, yeah, you know, he did just start this very challenging PhD program, and he thinks he is the last person who is in the room. I'll tell you, he's now teaching at Yale, so he obviously wasn't the last person in the room. But I thought, oh, so he doesn't have a few hours to do this for his mom. But he said, so Mom, you're a lawyer, which I am by training, a lawyer. So copyright laws? I said, well, Dutch and 50 years out of print. And at that point, he quoted back to me my own advice to him as he was growing up, which is, if you lose your integrity, you lose everything. So he went to his university librarian and found out how many pages he could copy and still comply with the US copyright laws. He sent me this table of contents. I Google translated it and based on the names of the chapters, tried to figure out which would be the most useful for me. And he got those pages for me. The 29 pages he got for me were in Dutch, which I don't speak or read. And actually, they were not just in Dutch, but they were in Dutch and German. That was a real challenge for the amazing translation team of Google Translate and yours truly. I would copy a few sentences, and if they came, this was in the early days of Google Translate too, so it was a challenge to start with. But then I would take a few sentences and I would run them through Google Translate, and sometimes they would turn up absolute gibberish, and I would have to go through and figure out where the German was and pull that out, separately translate everything, and Tetris it all back together. But those pages included some great details about Truce's involvement in the Kindertransport. And most importantly, a very short passage about one of the major obstacles to Truce helping children escape then Nazi-occupied Vienna, which was the German then in charge of Austria. He's pictured here with his wife. I will tell you, he loved his mother. He loved his children. He actually had a Jewish best friend when he was growing up. In many ways, he looks like a pretty regular guy, but he is a young and ambitious, not yet infamous Adolf Eichmann. Yeah, that one. The one who would, several years later, go on to devise the final solution that we're talking about today. He was the man in charge of Nazi-occupied Austria at the time, and Truce faced him down. I'm not going to tell you exactly how, because if you haven't read the novel yet, I want that to come to you. But if you have read the novel, I will tell you that the way that scene lays out is the way it did actually happen. So Toni Morrison once said, if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written, you must write it. I'm going to tell you that Toni Morrison was given both a Nobel and a Pulitzer, so she is somebody whose advice I take. And I hope you appreciate that nice segue away from Eichmann. He's an ugly dude. And this is a beautiful shot of the Herengracht in Amsterdam, where Truus lived. And I actually stayed, when the novel came out in the Netherlands and Belgium, I was brought to Europe for my first European tour ever. And I got some extraordinary experiences, including speaking at a Holocaust museum in Belgium with someone rescued by Truus. But I got to stay on a beautiful hotel overlooking this Herengracht. And this particular photo inspired a scene in the book that if you've read it, you'll probably recognize the people on the frozen canal. So I then enlisted a Dutch friend to help me find a copy of Truus's book. No Time for Tears is the English translation of the title. There were no copies for sale anywhere in the Netherlands. Her husband's a techie and he went searching for me and could not find a copy for sale anywhere in the world. There were no copies in her own library in a fairly major city in the Netherlands. But she had her librarian find a copy in one of the other libraries in the Netherlands and had them send it to her library. She checked it out and she photocopied it page by page for me. And before you worry about our integrity, I will tell you that it turns out to be in the Netherlands perfectly legal to copy a book that is this long out of print. So then I gathered some other images around me, including things like this bear that a child took with him or her on the train. Almost every child brought a German to English dictionary because they mostly didn't speak English. They were generally allowed a single suitcase, and they brought suitcases like this. This is a real suitcase that somebody brought. Most of the children went across to England on a ferry, and so they had ferry tickets. And I began to work on buttoning down the details, which is more difficult than you might imagine. One of the really impossible details to pin down was the day that the first kinder transport left Vienna. I actually had two sources which told me it was on a Monday, and they were the New York Times and the Times of London. They were very short little articles. They were the same stringer. There were literally 3 paragraphs, but I assumed that they were right. But then in translating Truus's book, she said that they actually left on the Sabbath. The Saturday after the Monday that the New York Times had them leaving. She had herself meeting with Eichmann on that Monday. So I tried to pin that down. I talked to the Holocaust Memorial Museum historians. I talked to people from the Kindertransport Association, and nobody knew the answer. The Marilyn Hacker, who leads the Kindertransport Association in the US, told me there are some things about the Kindertransport that we don't know and we may never know. But then I found in that same exhibit where I saw the bandage box, this boy's calendar. He left on that first Kindertransport, and you will see on the 10th there, on the Saturday, he leaves Vienna and then takes the ferry across on the Sunday, the 11th, to get to England. So I felt that was a small research triumph to find that Truus was right and the New York Times and the Times of London were wrong. I then started putting together the story in this very weird way that I write, which is with note cards and brainstorming, and I really just write any way I can. I outline, I do draft after draft, I research, I just do everything I can, including this, which is my card outline. And with that, and with, I will tell you that the last interviews I read or listened to or watched were the interviews that my son did. For whatever reason, I was very daunted at the prospect of asking about those stories, because I knew when I asked about those stories that I would be telling the remaining director that I was thinking about doing the story myself. So I went to her when I thought I actually had the story long after I found Truus, and I asked her if I could see those interviews. And her name is Pat, and Pat told me that she had promised Michael was the director who died of stomach cancer, she had promised Michael on his deathbed that she would do something with this story. She was by then dying herself, and was never going to do it herself. And so she basically put this story in my hands. She got somebody to help me dig through a storage locker and find those interviews and pull them out, and encouraged me every way in the writing of this story. The novel is dedicated to Michael, the director who brought the story to my son, who brought it to me, and I could not be more honored to have written this story. The real story is just truly inspiring and uplifting. The risk people took to save these children, often putting their own lives at risk. We need more of that in this world today. I'm truly humbled by the response to the novel, all the translations, the Jewish Book Award finalist, just the way it's been selling all around the world. And I'm incredibly grateful to be a part of Truce getting some of the recognition that perhaps she deserves. This is a brand new statue honoring her in her hometown in Alkmaar in the Netherlands. And I just received a few days ago a small casting of it. They did a few small castings of it and they sent one to me. So I'm just thrilled as anything about that. But most humbling for me are the responses I've received from the real people who were rescued in the effort. People like Marion Wolf, who wrote to tell me that she was number 211 on the first transport from Vienna, and that the way I wrote about it in the story was the same way that she remembered it. This fellow here on the left is Philip, and I will tell you that I met him he came to a reading I did in Southern California. And for those of you who've read the novel, he left Vienna when he was 5 years old, which is the age that my character Walter is in the novel. And he is exactly as you would imagine Walter would be as a grown man. This is Erica Hopper, whose mother, Gertrude Ruth Friedman Hopper, was on the 1938 transport from Vienna. She's pictured here with her granddaughter Naomi, her great-granddaughter Lucy, and obviously her daughter Erica. When Erica gave me this photo, she told me it was 4 generations of people who literally would not exist but for the kindness of strangers. This fellow is Paul Alexander. Paul lives in Israel. I haven't met him yet. We were going to meet, and then pandemic. He was coming to the United States and I was coming to Europe, but it didn't happen. So I still hope to meet him. But the book is not out in Hebrew yet. It sold at auction both in the United States and in Israel, and it is coming out in Hebrew, but it hasn't yet. But a friend of Paul's who read it in the United States and knows his story sent him a copy, and he read it and he wrote me. It turns out that Paul was put on a transport when he was 1 year and 7 months old, and he wrote me to say that he'd read a lot about the Kindertransport, but this novel, in bringing it alive to him, was especially meaningful, and to tell me that, as I hope in my dedication, my book more than does justice to his own story. This photo is of Paul with his son and grandson retracing the path of his train took, so hundreds of miles by bicycle, 80 years after it happened. So he's in his 80s here, and he is perhaps one of the most extraordinary people I've connected with, along with Margot. Honestly, if I had imagined any of these people reading my novel, I'm quite sure I would have been far too daunted to write it. It's Truce's story and that of the children and their families. But as I wrote it, I held in my heart the silence of my own son that day he came home and brought this story to me, this story that literally started with Margot. And I am so pleased that Margot is here. And I don't want to put her on the spot or anything, but I wonder if she might give us just a few minutes about her own story before we take questions. And I'll say that I emailed her a few times and she never did say she would do this. So I do feel I'm putting her a little on the spot. And Margot, you're welcome to decline if you would like. Okay, Margot, you have to put on your microphone.
There, I'm unmuted. Anything you want to know, anything you want to ask, go right ahead.
Well, so I'm going to say that, one of the things that I remember from Margot's interview is, it's funny, the details that move you. And so one of the things I remember was that she spoke in her interview about an apron that she brought with her in the suitcase. So maybe you could just talk for a minute about that apron and what you brought in and how you felt when you came.
Well, when when it was decided that I was going to, get on the kinder transport to England, my mother went out and bought some things for me to grow into rather than, just all the things I had. It was very limited. It was in one suitcase. I also had a little dictionary, which I still have. It was called 1,000 Words of English into German and German into English. And I also still have a pin box with which there were pins in it, plus a sewing kit that my mother put together for me to take. And I could take 40 grams of silver, which in my case was 2 teaspoons in a serving spoon, and my brother and my silver napkin rings. I came from a comfortable home, and which after 1938, 33 actually started deteriorating. I mean, in 35, my dad had to give up his business, and he became ill, and things got from bad to worse. Then I went to England in April of 1939, and I was sponsored by a family, and it was not the best 5 years of my life, but it did save my life. They kept reminding me that I was a refugee and I should be grateful to be where I am. I also ate with the maid in the kitchen. I did housework before and after school. And then war broke out on the 3rd of September 1939 in Europe. And they evacuated and left me and the maid in London to face the bombing, which we did. And a few months later, they said they couldn't afford me anymore. And I was sent to a hostel where I lived for 2 years. And, I finally befriended another girl we got very close to, and we asked permission to go back to London, and we did. We found jobs. We barely made our ends meet, but we were teenagers, and we managed to have fun. We met soldiers, mostly Americans, and we faced it. I mean, we went to undergrounds and ran into shelters, carried gas masks. But again, we were teenagers, and actually, I have to admit that. The entire trauma of my, survival, so to speak, I didn't realize it until I was an adult. I mean, as a child, you do as you're told. I mean, I was beholden to people, and I did what I was told, and I didn't realize it until I was an adult. But when I read a book by Leon Uris, Exodus, where it's described where the girl Karen leaves for Denmark, and she said bye to her father. At that point, I was married, I had a child, and I said to myself, like you did earlier, Meg, could I give up my child? And at that moment, I realized what my mother must have gone through, sending her 2 children away within 6 weeks of each other, knowing that she may never see us again, but just to save their lives. So I think this, does this answer your question? I can go on. I mean, it was.
I do think there is so much. There are so many heroes in this story, not the least the parents, but also, I mean, so many of the survivors like you, Margot, have made such a difference in the world, and I just think it's sort of amazing. Maybe what we could do is open up to questions, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I hope Margot will be as well.
Of course.
Folks, if you have questions, feel free, you can put them in the chat space, or if you want to just raise your hand and we will look for hands that are up and will identify you by name or by telephone number, if that's how you're on.
That's good.
There's a question that has come in from Jan Morris. How were the children chosen to go on the transport?
I think Margot has a pretty interesting story about how she got on the transport, don't you, Margot?
Yes, well, actually, they were selected. I think they picked orphans first, and then the most needy. And of course, I at that point was an orphan already. I mean, I had my mother, but my father had died. And I think that's why I was, selected at an early time. I mean, April of 39. Of course, the last transport was September of 39. But I think that it was chosen by needy, and as I said, the orphans were selected first, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I'll say that most of the research I've done is on the Vienna Kindertransport, because the Kindertransport's from Austria, because that's where our Truce brought out her first Kindertransport, and I pretty early on focused on that. But my understanding is that it was the choice of who would go was decided on the ground wherever the trains were leaving from, and so it varied from place to place. I believe in Vienna that there was a lot of discussion how to do it, and then but what they did was basically they were concerned about how they would even get the word out. But by the next morning, by the morning after Truce had gotten permission to take 600 children out, there were long lines at the place where they were to register. The word got out very quickly, and the miracle is that parents told each other, and people just showed up to register their children. And I know in Berlin that the first Kindertransport, the very first one that left on December 2nd from Berlin, and that was a group of 50 children taken literally from an orphanage. So it really depended on where you were and the time. And obviously the first Kindertransports were a little different than the later ones. Some of the later ones, the first Kindertransports, they just basically put children on a train very quickly and got them out. The later ones, what they did was they sent those children to a summer camp in Harwich in the UK, in England. It was summer camp, and it was the middle of winter. And so very quickly they realized, somebody who was there told me, we were given hot water bottles when we went to bed at night. And if your hot water bottle fell out of bed in the middle of the night, it would be frozen on the floor next to you the next morning. So they very quickly figured out that that was not going to be a great solution. And so then they started looking for sponsors. And then at some point in time, whether you were selected to go or not would depend entirely on whether somebody in England had chosen you from literally a bunch of pictures and short profiles of children, and that was the children who had sponsors who were allowed to go. So
those who did not have sponsors were taken by the committee, which was Bloomsbury House. They were sent to either other orphanages or farms or hostels.
Yes.
Because there was only so many sponsors they could get within a short period of time.
Exactly.
Steve Mizell, I see your hand up, and then there's a question in chat also. Go ahead, Steve.
Meg, you've kind of talked a bit about it in many different ways, but I was interested, when you take on a project like this, you're establishing a relationship with the project itself, and that builds relationship. And with time, did the project own you, or did you own the project? And how did that relationship affect you post publication of your novel?
It's interesting. Clearly, this project owned me. There's no doubt about it. In a way that I think no project ever has. I think that this, part of what happened is when I first was learning about this project, literally, when my son brought it home to me, my older son, the one who got the pages of Truce's book for me was getting ready to go off to the very scary halls of the University of Chicago. And so even letting my son go that far away from me was traumatic, and so it was a particularly meaningful time for me to be exploring this idea that people would let their children go on such young children, even on such a permanent basis. So so yeah, it definitely, the answer to that is definitely on me. I will tell you that. It's interesting when people talk about writing, I think they assume, one, that writing is much more about inspiration than it actually is, at least the way I write. The way I write is I start with something, anything, and I don't, I explore things, like in this project, I didn't know it was going to be a book until literally, almost a decade into researching it. And that is often the case, that I, one of the true blessings of being a writer is you get to spend your days learning about what you're particularly fascinated by, but you don't always know if there's going to be a book there or not until and sometimes there isn't a book. So I just take a piece and a piece, and I think there's a great Margaret Atwood quote that is a word after word after word is power. And I think that's true, but also for me, a word after word after word is story. So often I will, not knowing what I'm going to write, I will just sit down with my journal and I'll just write the word "the" and hope that some other nice words will come and join it, and it will eventually become a book. But the one thing I do think is I think that people think that writing is about inspiration, and I'm going to tell you that if I waited for inspiration, I would never write a word. If I didn't sit down until I was inspired, I would never write a word. So what I do is I sit down and write every morning. 5 or 6 mornings a week, sometimes 7 when I'm really jamming on it. But I think that a lot of writing comes from your subconscious, and you just have to sit down and let it come and see what's there. So anybody who wants to write, I would absolutely encourage you to do so, even if you never publish. It is an amazing way to come to know the world better, and to come to know yourself better. And it also passes the time in a pandemic pretty well, I'm going to say. So yeah. This definitely owned me. This story and these characters and people like Margot, and especially Margot, are a huge part of my heart now, and have made me a better person just from learning about them.
Great. Meg, Lois Miller asks, was Sophia Helena's math skills based on anyone in your research?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So I just said that my son was going off to University of Chicago, my older son, and I will tell you that he is a math major. He's now a very mathematical, he's a theoretical economist, which means he tells me he sits around all day and thinks up math problems in his head and occasionally writes them down. I will tell you, the things you don't realize until after you've written them. After I finished this story, I looked at that character of Zofia Lynn and I went, she wears glasses just like Chris did, and still does. They were always, I clean those glasses so many times the same way Stefan does. And so I saw only after the story was written that in many ways, Zofia Lynn is like Chris in so many ways. So I think that he was in some ways this kind of subconscious inspiration for Zofia Lynn. I also loved math. I was a geeky math science girl when I was growing up. I took exactly English was the only language, was the only subject that I did not AP in high school. And in college, I took the exact number of English classes that you had to take to get a degree. And then later on, when I was a junior, they offered a Tolkien class. And so I took that pass-fail. So I took a great book, Shakespeare and Tolkien. That was all. I loved math in a different time when now that math is a cool thing for girls to be. I might be a mathematician. But so I'm always reading about math, and making Zofia Len a mathematician allowed me to explore what was happening mathematically in Vienna at the time, which was very interesting. And Kurt Godel, who is her mentor in that story, he's a real person, and the work he did was real work, and I found it interesting. So that was fun to explore.
That's great. Bob Kahn asks, was the name of the book taken from The Lost Train with Jojo on it?
The Lost Train with, oh, yes, it was. Yes, exactly. The working title for the book was The Last Train, and then it was submitted as The Last Train to Baker Street because of Zofia Len's interest in Sherlock Holmes, but it was always The Last Train, and it was meant to be a nod to. I mean, I think I want to tell a hopeful story. I think the best way to inspire people is with hopeful stories to the extent you can. I think for me, it would be really hard to write something set at Auschwitz, for example, because it is such a hard place to find hope. But in this moment, in Kindertransport, obviously there was a lot of hope there. But I also felt like you could, if you tell this kind of story without acknowledging the rest of the Shoah, then you Disneyize it, I guess I would say. You Hollywoodize it. You make it a happy story when, in fact, as Margot's own experience, it was not unrelentingly happy by any stretch of the imagination. That last train, which came from Prague, did leave Prague before the war began. But then the war began, and it was not allowed to leave Germany. And nobody knows what happened to those children. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the children on that last train. It was turned back, and the presumption is that they were all sent to the camps. So yeah, that is definitely where the last train comes from.
Yeah. Ronna Klein asked a question. Ronna, I might need you to help clarify just a little bit. Did you write the book in order that it ended up being an actual published book?
Did you, my question is did you write it in a linear, I'm going to start here, finish here?
It's a good question, Ronna. I think I sometimes write books under contract, which is a really blessed place to be writing books under contract. I was not in that position when I began this story. And if you don't have a contract for a book, and even if you do, honestly, you don't know if it's going to be a book until it becomes a book. That is especially true of fiction, because it all depends on the execution, whether the story works or not. If the story works and it moves people, then somebody will buy it and publish it. And if it doesn't, sadly, publishing is a business, and so I didn't know if this would be a book, and in fact, I didn't even begin it as a book. I began it as a screenplay. The reason I did that was because I was really daunted by this story. I mean, I cannot impress upon you. I assume that most of you all are Jewish. I'm not Jewish, and taking on this story was very daunting for me. Actually, when I first learned about the Kindertransport, I called up my agent, Marley Rusoff, who is Jewish, and I said, there's this incredible story. It's called the Kindertransport, and nobody's written about it yet, and you should give it to one of your Jewish writers and tell them to write it. And she told me at the time, her direct answer to that was, you should write this story. And I said, no, I'm not Jewish. I can't write this story. And she said, no, you should write this story. And every time I wrote, I published 4 other books in between when I learned about the Kindertransport, at least 4 others, before I learned about the Kindertransport and before I wrote this book. And every time I'd be pitching a new book, Marley would say, you should write that book about the Kindertransport. But I didn't think I was the right one to write it. And so once I started imagining that maybe I'd write something about it, I thought, well, I'll write it as a screenplay, because I have no idea how to write a screenplay. I'm not a screenplay writer. There will be no expectation whatsoever for this story, and I can just play with it as a story. And so that's how I wrote it first as a screenplay. when the screenplay was done, I showed it to my husband, who was my first reader for everything, and he said, "This is a great story. What are you going to do with it?" I said, "Well, it's you know, I think I'm going to use it as an outline for a novel if you think it's a story." And he said, "No, it's a great screenplay. You should do something with it as a screenplay." I did ultimately submit it to something called the Writers Lab, which is Meryl Streep and Nicole Kidman's effort to bring more women's voices into film, and it was accepted as one of the 12 screenplays that year. So I've been working on the screenplay with a woman who is literally an Oscar-nominated screenplay. She's been mentoring me. And I have a great film agent, but the film it's literally a $50 million film to make, and it happened to go out in March of last year, just as the screenplay was being submitted to producers, just as COVID was hitting, and filming movies has become very, very complicated as a result of COVID. So nothing's happened to it yet. So we'll see, we'll hope. But anyway, that's how I wrote it first.
That's great. Thank you, Meg. We got a question from Sally Abel, who writes, "Margot, I am here in California with my mother and your good friend Marion Stull, who has told me many times how amazing you are," which of course we all know that and are grateful to. The love of you goes literally coast to coast and beyond. She's right, of course. My question is, did you ever go back, Margot? Did you ever go back?
Yes, I was invited to go back to Frankfurt as a former citizen in 1996. That was my first trip back. I went back a second time when I met my youngest son there for a couple of days before we went on a family vacation, because he had never been there. And then I was back a year and a half ago with Lindsay and his wife Regina for a stone setting, which is now being done in commemoration of the victims who were killed during the Nazi era. And in my mother's case, they said 3 stones, one for her, one for my brother, and one for me. And these are copper plates set into the sidewalk. And they say the name, the date of birth, and where the victim or the survivor either perished or emigrated to. And in my case, it was, my mother, at that time, it was not even known yet what happened to her. And my brother went to Israel and I went to England. Yes, that's the last time I went. And I'm again invited to go for a unveiling of a memorial which they are doing on the Kindertransport, which is designed by an Israeli artist and is being unveiled, maybe, we don't even know yet exactly, later, early summer, later summer, we don't know yet. But if all is well and things are possible, I may go for that unveiling.
May I ask, Margot, I know a dear friend of mine whose some of his grandparents passed away in the Shoah, went back and reclaimed German citizenship. Is that something you or anybody in your family has done or thought about doing?
I would never even consider it, but I do know someone who did, yes. In fact, yeah. And, they felt that it might be helpful. I don't quite know why, but it's to me, it's hard to believe.
Those stones, it's interesting you talk about those stones, because one rainy Saturday morning in Vienna, I spent about 6 hours just wandering around the Leopoldstadt neighborhood in Vienna, which is covered with those stones. And it is, they make such a moving memorial that it's just there every day as an everyday reminder. And I think they are a particularly meaningful way to, light that sixth candle. So.
Well, I'm glad that there are memorials being erected, no matter which form they take, but at least it's recognition that what was done and what happened. And because it took a long time for especially Germany to admit as to what went on. So this at least gives it kind of recognition, for which I am grateful.
Yes, and I think honestly in Austria, that there isn't even, I mean, I think Germany has taken some responsibility. In Austria, Austria seems to view itself as the first victim of Nazi Germany, as opposed to a perpetuator of the Nazi horrors. And so it was, I actually found when I was in Austria was particularly disturbing, because there was just like very little recognition there of what had happened.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yes, it did happen, but you do find these memorials all over Europe now, and which is good that it's admitted.
Yeah.
Barring any other questions, we can begin to close off our time tonight with each other. I don't see any hands raised or anything going into chat. To Meg or to Margot, if there are any other closing words that you wanted to share, otherwise we'll close off our time together on this night, and I'll just have a closing comment.
I would just like to thank you all for allowing me to share this evening with you, and again, especially Margot. It's I've spoken a lot now, and I'm rarely daunted, but I found as I was contemplating this evening's event that I was quite daunted, and I think it's in part because of the day and the importance of the memories on this particular day, and so I'm really glad to have you all to share it with. So thank you for including me.
And I want to take this moment to a special thank you to Meg for doing this for us and coming here to speak to us. I met Meg in person last year when I was in California, and it was just unbelievable. We sat on a bench for 3 hours and talked, and she's become a friend, and a very dear friend, and I treasure her. And thank you, Meg, for doing this and coming out here, for being here, even via Zoom.
And
thank you, Rabbi, for.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi.
It's our honor, really. I thank Lindsay and Margot for bringing Meg to our attention and to planning this night tonight. Regina, you're in there also as you guys are visiting Mark and family and the new baby, and it's wonderful to see. What a simcha. During the Omer, where we are right now, we counted the 11th day tonight. Each week has a name. Each week has a name and kind of a character trait of God's that is manifest in us, or we try to manifest in us. This is the week of what's called Gevurah. Gevurah is might, heroism, and to think about this day is, yes, the full name, Yom HaShoah, the day to remember the catastrophe, the disaster that was, the lives that were lost, murdered, and the resistance. And truce is such a model of resistance, such a model of resistance. And I'm going to be so bold as to go on and say, Margot, every time you tell that story, you're living and you're having another great-grandchild show up today. That is the continued resistance. Meg, your contribution of this book, and that we continue, that is a way to continually to resist not just what was, but what we see in our own world today that demands the same kind of passion and response to make sure that the evil that has existed, and it's there today because that's part of the human condition, that we work against it and we fight against it, because that is literally what we are commanded, Zachor. Not just the command voice, remember, it is be in the state of remembering. Be aware, lo tishkach, and don't forget. So we get it in both directions, the positive and a negative commandment, a to do and a not to do. We bring all of that together. And when we think of words, because what else can we do but think of words and words from our sacred scriptures? I just am putting something in the chat space. It comes from Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the heavens. Where does my help come from? It comes from the maker of heaven and earth. God imbues godliness in each of us. Jew, non-Jew, white, black, we're all have that chance to be that help, the way that God has been a creator, so we can create worlds with our words and most importantly, our actions, what we do and how we care for one another. So we'll close off with this psalm from Psalm 121. Esahenai el heharim me'ayin yavo ezri. Esahenai el heharim me'ayin yavo ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai Ose shamayim va'aretz. Ezri me'im Adonai Ose shamayim va'aretz. Zichronam livracha. May the memory of all the tzaddikim, all those who have been righteous and have worked for that which is just and fair and good in our world, may their memory be for a blessing. May those who died, we remember their lives and their families, those worlds that were taken. May the memory of them inspire and drive us to bring about blessing in our day and in our world. May we do so in good health and in peace, and let us say, Amen. It is customary when we have our Yom HaShoah in our sanctuary that we come in quietly, we sit with one another, and then we begin with the siren as we did tonight. And so too, it's one of our services that we leave quietly, that we don't, as much as we love to sit in kibbutz and be with one another, we leave quietly after Yom HaShoah. In Israel, there's a remarkable observance that's done, which is radio stations and TV stations, if they're not doing programming related to the Shoah and the resistance, they simply go dark and they put up a Yizkor candle to show on the TV stations, and the radios just go quiet. Otherwise, there's programming. So maybe you find some time this evening or tomorrow during the day of Yom HaShoah to read an article, to find a YouTube video, to visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial website or Yad Vashem's website. Take a moment to do a little study, further your learning, or just hear a song and let those memories hold on and keep them in our hearts. Again, many thanks to Meg for your work with this book and your presence tonight. Thank you, Lindsay, and to our Brotherhood for your support and the donations that are being made, and you can do them through the Brotherhood for the Jewish Fund for the Righteous. But if you make the donation to the Brotherhood, they will direct that to the righteous Gentiles who help to keep our people alive. So, like truce. Thank you all on this night. If you want to unmute just to say a good night or thank you, please feel free to do so.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, all. Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Meg. Very special program. Thank you.
Good night and thank